The morning of September 19th, 1944, brought fog so thick that Oberleutnant Klaus Richter could barely see 10 meters beyond his Panther's glacis plate. Somewhere in the French countryside near Arracourt, American tanks waited in the mist. Richter adjusted his throat microphone and scanned the grey void through his commander's cupola, confident in the 80mm sloped armour protecting his crew. Every German tanker knew the truth that had sustained them through the summer's brutal fighting. American Shermans could not penetrate a Panther from the front. It was a law of physics, proven in 100 engagements from Normandy to Lorraine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Panther beneath him represented Germany's answer to the Soviet 34, a masterpiece of ballistic engineering rushed into production after the shock of encountering Russian armour on the Eastern Front. At nearly 45 tons, mounting a powerful 75mm KBUK-42 gun capable of destroying Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, the Panther had restored German confidence after the disasters of Stalingrad and Kursk. Its sloped frontal armour, angled at 55 degrees and effectively equivalent to 140mm of protection, had proven nearly invulnerable to standard Allied anti-tank weapons. Richter had commanded Panthers since March, fighting a grinding withdrawal across Ukraine before his unit received orders to refit in Germany. The new 113th Panzer Brigade, formed around a core of Eastern Front survivors and filled out with fresh conscripts straight from training depots, represented Germany's latest attempt to stem the Allied advance racing toward the Reich's borders. His crew consisted of 4 men who had never worked together before this week. The driver, barely 19, had logged less than 50 hours behind Panther controls. The gunner claimed combat experience, but Richter suspected the man had seen action only in the final chaotic weeks before the unit's evacuation. Factory new Panthers filled the brigade's ranks, their Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste still pristine, tracks unmarred by combat wear. On paper, the brigade possessed overwhelming firepower. In reality, Richter commanded a formation of powerful tanks crewed by inexperienced men, launched into battle with minimal preparation against an enemy whose tactical sophistication had grown deadly during 4 months of continuous fighting across France. The fog shifted, revealing a Sherman silhouette 80 meters ahead. Richter's heart hammered as he identified the distinctive rounded hull and turret. The range was absurdly close for tank combat, well inside even the Sherman's limited effective engagement envelope. Yet Richter felt confident. At this distance, his gunner could place rounds through the American tank's thin armour with mechanical precision. The Sherman's 75mm gun, however, posed no threat to the Panther's frontal protection. He opened his mouth to issue fire commands when the Sherman's turret traversed with startling speed. Richter barely registered the muzzle flash before something struck his Panther's gun mantlet with tremendous force. The impact sound differed from previous combat experiences, sharper, more violent. Then smoke began pouring from the crew compartment hatches. "Bail out!" Richter screamed, his training overriding shock. The driver and radio operator scrambled from their hull hatches as Richter pulled himself through the commander's cupola. Behind him, flames erupted from the turret basket as ammunition detonated, the distinctive crack of 75mm rounds cooking off in rapid succession. His gunner never made it out. Richter hit the ground and sprinted for a nearby hedgerow, expecting machine gun fire to cut him down. None came. The Sherman, its job completed, reversed into better cover and disappeared into the fog. Only when Richter reached relative safety did he process what had occurred. That Sherman had penetrated his Panther's frontal armour, from 80 meters granted, but the mantlet should have deflected such a shot, not allowed catastrophic penetration that detonated ammunition within seconds. Throughout that fog-shrouded morning, similar scenes played across the fields around Arracourt. Panthers advancing blindly toward American positions encountered withering fire from concealed Shermans that systematically destroyed German tanks with a precision and lethality that defied every tactical assumption drilled into German crews. By noon, when the fog finally lifted, the 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 43 Panthers. American casualties stood at 5 Shermans destroyed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The catastrophic losses at Arracourt sent shock waves through German command structures. Oberst Heinrich Vogel, commanding officer of the 5th Panzer Army's reconnaissance units, reviewed combat reports with mounting disbelief. His staff had compiled testimony from surviving Panther commanders describing American tank shells punching through frontal armor that intelligence assessments deemed impenetrable to Sherman guns. Either German armor had suffered catastrophic manufacturing defects, or American weapons capability had improved dramatically without warning. The timing could not have been worse for German forces. Operation Overlord's success had shattered Army Group West, destroying 30 divisions and forcing survivors into headlong retreat across France. By September, American armored spearheads had reached Lorraine and established bridgeheads across the Moselle River. German attempts to stabilize the front depended critically on deploying newly formed panzer brigades to conduct counterattacks that would disrupt American momentum and buy time for defensive preparations along the Siegfried Line. These new brigades represented Germany's attempt to leverage industrial capacity and armored technology to offset catastrophic personnel and equipment losses. Each brigade contained approximately 90 tanks, predominantly Panthers with some Panzer IV support, organized into 2 battalions. The concept emphasized concentrated armored striking power that could be rapidly deployed to threatened sectors. In theory, properly employed Panther battalions could devastate American tank formations, whose Shermans could not penetrate German frontal armor. The Battle of Arracourt destroyed this theory with brutal finality. Combat Command A of the American 4th Armored Division, numbering approximately 160 tanks against the German force of 260 armored vehicles, had systematically dismantled German attacks through superior tactics, better use of terrain, devastating artillery coordination, and most shockingly, the ability to frontally engage and destroy Panthers. German intelligence officers examining destroyed American ammunition found their worst suspicions confirmed. The projectiles that had killed Panthers at Arracourt were not standard armor-piercing rounds. The recovered fragments showed characteristics of specialized tungsten-cored ammunition, similar in principle to Germany's own Panzergranate 40 rounds but deployed at scale that German production could never match. Technical analysis of the ammunition, which American forces designated M93 high-velocity armor-piercing, revealed sophisticated engineering. A tungsten carbide core weighing approximately 400 grams, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body that increased muzzle velocity to over 1,000 meters per second, created a projectile capable of concentrating enormous kinetic energy onto a small impact area. Against the Panther's gun mantlet, curved cast steel approximately 100 millimeters thick on early models, the tungsten penetrator could punch through at ranges approaching 1,000 meters. This represented a fundamental shift in the tactical balance. German tankers had entered the Normandy campaign confident that Panther frontal armor provided near-complete protection against Allied anti-tank weapons. American Shermans, equipped with standard 75mm guns, could not penetrate Panthers frontally at any combat range. Even the improved 76mm gun that began appearing on Shermans in July 1944 struggled against Panther armor, capable of mantlet penetration only at suicidal ranges under 100 meters. The introduction of HVAP ammunition transformed the 76mm Sherman from a tank incapable of frontally engaging Panthers into a weapon that could achieve reliable penetration on the mantlet at tactically useful ranges. For German crews who had learned to trust their frontal armor, this change proved psychologically devastating. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber commanded a Panther company that survived the initial Arracourt fighting. His after-action report, captured by American intelligence after the war, described the psychological impact with stark clarity. On September 20th, my company engaged American tanks at approximately 600 meters. We achieved multiple hits on enemy vehicles without achieving penetration. Their return fire struck our tanks with immediate catastrophic effect. 3 Panthers destroyed in under 2 minutes, all from frontal hits that should have been impossible. Crew confidence evaporated. Subsequent engagements saw hesitation, defensive positioning, reluctance to close with the enemy. When crews lose faith in their armor, they cease functioning as an effective combat unit. Erosion of confidence rippled through German armored formations with demoralizing speed. Panther crews began treating their tanks not as superior weapons that could dominate American armor, but as vulnerable targets requiring extreme caution. Tactics shifted from aggressive to defensive, from seeking engagement to avoiding contact unless circumstances offered overwhelming advantage. The psychological transformation from predator to prey occurred within days of the first HVAP encounters. German command struggled to develop countermeasures against ammunition they could barely produce themselves. Tungsten supplies, already critically constrained by Allied strategic bombing of supply routes and loss of Swedish imports, could not sustain large-scale tungsten-cored ammunition production. Germany's own Panzergranate 40 rounds remained in perpetually short supply throughout 1944, issued sparingly to elite units facing Soviet heavy armor on the Eastern Front. The idea of matching American HV production was fantasy. Alternative solutions focused on tactical adaptation and improvised armor reinforcement. Panzer commanders received updated doctrine emphasizing terrain usage, maintaining greater engagement distances, and avoiding static defensive positions where American gunners could take careful aim. Crews began welding spare track links and road wheels onto mantlets and turret faces, creating improvised spaced armor intended to disrupt tungsten penetrators before they reached primary armor. These field modifications achieved mixed results. Additional armor, mass-degraded Panther mobility, and increased mechanical stress on transmissions already prone to failure. Spaced armor sometimes deflected HVAP rounds, but often proved insufficient against the projectile's kinetic energy. More significantly, the modifications required time and resources increasingly scarce, as Allied air superiority and logistics interdiction strangled German supply networks. The strategic implications of HVAP deployment extended beyond individual tank battles. German defensive planning for autumn 1944 had assumed that small numbers of Panthers properly positioned could delay much larger American formations for extended periods. One Panther in a good defensive position could theoretically hold off an entire Sherman platoon, forcing American forces to call in artillery, air support, or specialized tank destroyers before continuing their advance. HVAP ammunition undermined this calculation. Shermans that previously required overwhelming numerical advantage or tactical brilliance to destroy Panthers could now engage German heavy armor directly, with reasonable expectation of success. The arithmetic of defensive warfare shifted decisively against Germany. Holding critical positions now required committing more Panthers, tanks that existed in insufficient numbers and could not be replaced as losses mounted. By late September 1944, as the Battle of Arracourt ground toward its inevitable conclusion with German forces withdrawn and American positions consolidated, the psychological damage to German armored forces proved as significant as material losses. Panthers remained formidable weapons, superior to Shermans in armor protection, firepower, and mobility when functioning properly. But the sense of invulnerability that had sustained German tank crews through brutal fighting had shattered against the reality of American tungsten-cored ammunition. Lieutenant Hans Steiner, a Tiger commander who fought at Arracourt before transferring to the Eastern Front, later described the shift in German tanker psychology in his post-war memoir. "We had been taught that our armor made us untouchable from the front. Every briefing, every training session emphasized that frontal armor was our shield. Keep the front toward the enemy and you would survive. Then, at Arracourt, that certainty died. Panthers burned from frontal hits. Crews who had trusted their armor learned that protection was an illusion. The Americans had found our weakness and they exploited it mercilessly. After Arracourt, every German tanker fought with the knowledge that their armor could fail, that they were not invincible. That knowledge changed how we fought, made us cautious when we needed to be aggressive, defensive when we needed to attack. The Americans had not just developed better ammunition, they had destroyed our confidence." The development of HVAP ammunition represented a remarkable American industrial and engineering achievement accomplished under tremendous time pressure. The story began not in 1944 but years earlier, when Ordnance Department engineers explored tungsten-cored ammunition as a potential counter to increasingly heavy enemy armor. Early experiments demonstrated the concept's potential, but tungsten scarcity and uncertain combat requirements kept the program at low priority through 1942 and early 1943. The situation changed dramatically, with intelligence reports from the Italian campaign describing German Panther and Tiger tanks whose armor defeated all standard American anti-tank weapons. By early 1944, as preparations for Operation Overlord accelerated, Ordnance recognized that American armored forces would face German heavy tanks in numbers far exceeding initial estimates. The standard 75mm Sherman gun, adequate against earlier German armor, appeared woefully inadequate against Panthers. The 76mm Mohn gun, developed as an improvement over the standard 75, entered production in January 1944. The first Sherman tanks mounting this weapon arrived in Britain by April, intended for deployment in the Normandy invasion. Yet American commanders refused to land these improved tanks on D-Day, citing insufficient crew training, logistical complications of supporting two different ammunition types, and misplaced confidence that existing weapons would prove adequate. This decision proved catastrophic. When American forces encountered Panthers in the Norman hedgerows during June and early July, Sherman crews discovered their guns could not penetrate German frontal armor at any range. Crew casualties soared as Panthers destroyed Shermans with impunity, while American return fire bounced harmlessly off sloped German armor. By early July, desperate requests from frontline units forced rush deployment of 76mm Shermans to France, with the first reaching combat on July 25 during Operation Cobra. Even the improved 76mm gun disappointed, capable of penetrating Panther mantlets only at suicidal ranges under 100 meters. General Dwight Eisenhower, upon learning that the weapon he had been assured would defeat any German tank remained ineffective against Panthers, reportedly exploded with fury. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why is it that I'm the last to hear about this stuff? Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." The crisis forced emergency prioritization of HVAP ammunition development. Engineering teams at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland worked frantically to perfect the tungsten-cored round, designated T4 during development and later standardized as M93. The projectile featured a tungsten carbide core, approximately 3.4 times as long as its diameter, surrounded by aluminum alloy body sections that reduced overall weight while maintaining structural integrity during barrel transit. This design achieved muzzle velocities exceeding 3,000 feet per second, compared to approximately 2,600 feet per second for standard armor-piercing rounds. The velocity increase, combined with the tungsten core's superior density and hardness, enabled the M93 to penetrate approximately 160 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards when striking at favorable angles. Testing confirmed that HVAP could reliably penetrate Panther gun mantlets at ranges approaching 1,000 meters, transforming the tactical equation. The challenge became production. Tungsten carbide required for penetrator cores remained in desperately short supply, with competing demands from machine tool production, armor-piercing machine gun ammunition, and various industrial processes. Shooting precious tungsten at German tanks represented a new requirement that stressed already constrained supplies. Production ramped slowly through summer 1944. The first 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP, completed in July, were shipped by air to Europe in time for field testing against captured Panthers near Isigny, France in early August. The tests confirmed effectiveness, and remaining rounds were immediately issued to frontline tank units. A second batch of 1,000 rounds followed by air in August, but subsequent shipments came via standard surface transport, requiring approximately 10 weeks transit time. Monthly HVAP production reached only 5,000 rounds by November 1944, gradually increasing to 7,000 per month by January 1945. These production numbers, while representing significant industrial effort, remained far below tactical requirements. With hundreds of 76mm Shermans in Europe, and each tank ideally carrying 20 or more HVAP rounds, demand vastly exceeded supply throughout the campaign. Ammunition allocation became a constant source of operational tension. Tank destroyer battalions, whose specific mission focused on anti-tank combat, received priority for scarce HVAP supplies. Sherman tanks, with dual roles supporting infantry and engaging enemy armor, often received only 2 to 6 rounds per vehicle. Some units exhausted their allocation within days of receiving it and faced lengthy delays before resupply arrived. This scarcity forced commanders into agonizing prioritization decisions. Should HVAP be reserved exclusively for Panthers and Tigers, or could it be used against Panzer IVs and assault guns? Should allocation favor tanks likely to encounter heavy German armor, or should it be distributed evenly to ensure all units possessed some capability? Different commands adopted different policies, creating inefficiencies where some units stockpiled more HVAP than they could use while others fought without any. The Battle of Arracourt occurred during this transitional period when HVAP existed in sufficient quantities to impact tactical outcomes, but remained scarce enough to require careful management. American tank crews at Arracourt typically carried 4 to 6 HVAP rounds per vehicle, carefully husbanded for engagements against German heavy armor. This allocation, though limited, proved adequate for the battle's circumstances where fog, terrain, and superior American tactics created engagement conditions that maximized HVAP effectiveness while minimizing ammunition expenditure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German intelligence officers analyzing the Arracourt disaster confronted uncomfortable truths about American industrial capacity. The United States had not merely developed superior ammunition, but had manufactured it in quantities sufficient to equip frontline combat units, despite tungsten being a scarce strategic material globally. This accomplishment reflected industrial mobilization on a scale Germany could not match even at the height of its power, much less in autumn 1944, with strategic bombing devastating production facilities and Allied advances severing supply lines. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The comparison between American and German tungsten ammunition programs revealed stark disparities in resource allocation and production priorities. Germany had pioneered tungsten-cored anti-tank ammunition with the Panzergranate 40 series, developed before the war and deployed against French and British armor in 1940. German engineers understood tungsten's advantages perfectly, yet German industry never achieved large-scale production due to supply constraints and competing priorities. By 1944, German tungsten sources had collapsed. Pre-war imports from China ceased, with Japanese occupation closing supply routes. Swedish tungsten exports to Germany declined sharply, as Allied diplomatic pressure and military fortunes turned against the Reich. German domestic tungsten deposits in Saxony and the Erzgebirge provided some supply, but nowhere near requirements for both ammunition and critical industrial tooling. Faced with impossible choices, German planners allocated scarce tungsten primarily to machine tools, essential for aircraft engine production and other critical manufacturing. Panzergranate 40 ammunition received low priority, manufactured in small batches for elite units facing Soviet heavy armor. German tank crews in the West rarely saw tungsten-cored ammunition, fighting instead with conventional armor-piercing rounds, whose effectiveness declined against increasingly heavy Allied armor. American tungsten supply, while also constrained, benefited from multiple sources and more flexible allocation. The United States imported tungsten from China before Japanese advances closed those routes, then shifted procurement to South American sources, particularly Bolivia and Peru. Domestic production from Colorado, Nevada, and California mines ramped up throughout the war. Most critically, American planners, once committed to HVAP production, allocated sufficient tungsten to sustain meaningful ammunition output despite competing industrial demands. This reflected broader patterns distinguishing American and German industrial approaches. German industry, stressed by years of total war, Allied bombing, and shrinking resource base, struggled to respond to changing tactical requirements. Developing new ammunition types required retooling factories, reallocating scarce materials, and adjusting production schedules at precisely the moment when German industrial capacity was contracting under relentless pressure. American industry, operating at peak capacity by 1944 but largely immune to enemy action, could respond to tactical problems with remarkable speed. When frontline commanders identified the Panther threat as critical, American industrial mobilization shifted priorities, allocated resources, and ramped production within months. The time from recognizing the problem in July to meaningful HVAP supplies reaching Europe in September represented industrial responsiveness that Germany could no longer match. Oberst-Vogel's intelligence assessment, completed in early October 1944, painted a grim picture for German armored forces. The report, later captured and analyzed by American forces, concluded that American HVAP deployment represented not just a tactical challenge, but evidence of industrial superiority that would shape subsequent fighting. Vogel recommended immediate tactical adaptations, improved armor protection measures, and realistic assessments of what German armored forces could achieve against an enemy possessing both numerical superiority and increasingly capable anti-tank weapons. German tactical doctrine evolved in response, though evolution came too late, and with insufficient resources to matter strategically. Panzer commanders received updated engagement guidelines emphasizing several key principles. First, avoid frontal engagements with American tanks whenever possible, instead maneuvering for flank shots where Sherman armor remained vulnerable. Second, maintain greater engagement distances, exploiting the Panther's superior gun range to engage before entering the effective range of American HVAP rounds. Third, use terrain more aggressively, fighting from reverse slope positions and hull-down locations that minimized exposure to enemy fire. These tactical adjustments made sense theoretically but proved difficult to execute practically. Avoiding frontal engagements required mobility and tactical freedom that German forces rarely possessed by autumn 1944. With American forces generally on the offensive and Germans defending, German tanks often fought from static positions where American combined arms tactics could develop overwhelming local superiority. Maintaining greater engagement distances worked only when terrain and tactical situation permitted, conditions increasingly rare as American forces pressed their advantages. The psychological dimension proved as challenging as the tactical one. Panther crews had been trained, equipped, and psychologically prepared to rely on frontal armor protection. German tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive engagement, trusting armor to protect crews while the powerful 75mm gun destroyed enemies at range. HVAP ammunition undermined this entire psychological framework, creating uncertainty where confidence had existed. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt commanded a Panther platoon with the 2nd SS Panzer Division during fighting in Holland during October 1944. His combat journal, preserved in German military archives, recorded the psychological shift with brutal honesty. October 7th. Engaged American Shermans near Oberleutnant. Achieved 3 hits on lead tank without penetration. Their return fire struck Schmidt's tank, my platoon sergeant, through the mantlet at approximately 700 meters. Catastrophic kill. Entire crew lost. This is the 3rd Panther I have lost to frontal penetration in 10 days. Crew morale deteriorating badly. Men hesitate before engaging enemy tanks, knowing our armor may not protect us. Confidence in equipment eroding. Without faith in our tanks, we are merely targets waiting to die. This erosion of confidence spread through German armored formations like a disease, degrading combat effectiveness in ways that statistics could not capture. Crews that questioned their armor's protection became more cautious, slower to engage, less willing to accept risks that aggressive tactics required. The psychological advantage that superior German tanks had provided throughout 1943 and early 1944 evaporated as HVAP demonstrated that Panther frontal armor, while still formidable, was no longer invulnerable. For American tank crews, the arrival of HVAP ammunition created the opposite psychological effect. Sherman crews, who had spent June and July in Normandy watching friends die in lopsided battles against Panthers, suddenly possessed a weapon that offered hope. The transformation from helpless to capable, from outmatched to competitive, restored morale and aggressive spirit that early losses had threatened to extinguish. Staff Sergeant Robert Miller commanded a Sherman with the 6th Armoured Division through the autumn campaigns in Lorraine and Alsace. His letter home in November 1944, preserved in family archives and later donated to the National World War II Museum, captured the psychological shift. "We got this new ammo they call HVAP a few weeks back. They told us it could punch through a Panther's front if we aimed right and got close enough. Didn't quite believe it until Tommy, he's our gunner, knocked out a Panther at about 800 yards last week, hit it square on the turret, and the whole thing just exploded. After months of feeling like we were driving coffins against those German tanks, suddenly we've got a fighting chance. Makes all the difference knowing you can hit back effectively. The guys are more confident now, more willing to mix it up when we spot German armour. It's not that the Sherman suddenly became a great tank, but at least now we're not completely outclassed." The confidence restoration among American crews manifested in improved tactical performance. Tank commanders who had previously called for artillery or air support when spotting Panthers now engaged directly, trusting their HVAP rounds to achieve penetration under favourable circumstances. This aggressiveness, combined with continued American advantages in artillery support, air superiority, and combined arms coordination, created tactical situations where German armour fought at persistent disadvantage despite technical superiority in individual tank characteristics. Training programs evolved to incorporate HVAP employment doctrine. Gunnery instructors emphasized shot placement, explaining that HVAP's tungsten core, while powerful, could shatter if striking armour at extreme angles or if velocity had dropped too much at extended range. Optimal aim points were the flatter sections of Panther mantlets and turret faces, where the penetrator could impact at favourable angles. Gunners practiced identifying these aim points in split-second engagements, knowing combat would rarely offer carefully aimed shots at stationary targets. Technical limitations of HVAP received honest discussion in training. The tungsten carbide core's brittleness meant that below certain impact velocities, approximately 2,300 to 2,500 feet per second, the core might shatter on contact rather than penetrating. This established effective range limits against Panther mantlets at roughly 1,000 meters. Beyond this distance, penetration probability declined sharply. Experienced crews learned these limitations through combat, sometimes tragically when HVAP rounds fired at excessive ranges failed to penetrate and provoked devastating return fire from German guns that remained effective at much longer ranges. The allocation of HVAP ammunition created operational challenges that commanders at multiple levels struggled to resolve. With production unable to meet demand, difficult decisions about prioritization became routine. Some commanders hoarded HVAP supplies, restricting use to only the most critical engagements. Others distributed ammunition more liberally, accepting that units might exhaust supplies quickly, but judging that psychological benefits of knowing HVAP was available outweighed conservation concerns. Different tactical situations demanded different approaches. Tank destroyer battalions, whose sole purpose was engaging enemy armour, clearly deserved priority allocation. Yet Sherman tanks, more numerous and more likely to encounter German armour during combined arms operations, arguably needed HVAP just as desperately. The allocation system, managed at Army, Corps, and Division levels, resulted in inevitable inefficiencies. Some units received more ammunition than tactical situations required, while others fought with critically inadequate supplies. The Battle of the Bulge, beginning December 16, 1944, tested American armoured forces under the most challenging circumstances of the entire campaign. German forces, husbanding their last significant armoured reserves, launched a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes region, catching American forces by surprise and creating a dangerous salient threatening to reach the Meuse River and potentially split Allied forces. The German offensive deployed hundreds of Panthers and Tiger tanks in concentrated formations, seeking to achieve breakthrough before Allied reinforcements and air superiority could contain the penetration. For American tank units caught in the initial assault or rushed forward as reinforcements, the next weeks would test whether tactical improvements and HVAP ammunition could enable defense against Germany's best remaining armored formations. Staff Sergeant Miller's Sherman, transferred from Alsace to help contain the bulge, found itself defending a critical crossroads near Bastogne within days of the German attack. His after-action report, filed in January 1945, described the desperate fighting. December 20th. German armour attacking in company strength, mixture of Panthers and Panzer IVs. We're hull down behind rubble with good fields of fire across approach roads. Gunner engages lead Panther at 700 meters using HVAP. First round achieves penetration. Panther burns. Second, Panther maneuvers to flank. Gunner traverses. Fires HVAP at approximately 600 meters. Hit on turret face, penetration, catastrophic secondary explosion. Third, Panther withdraws rather than continuing attack. Crew confidence high despite desperate tactical situation. HVAP giving us capability to contest German armour that would have been suicide missions 6 months ago. Similar engagements occurred across the Bulge battle space as American armoured units, though surprised and initially overwhelmed by German offensive scale, discovered they could fight German heavy armour with reasonable expectation of success when tactical circumstances permitted. HVAP ammunition, by now standard issue with most Shermans carrying between 10 and 20 rounds, enabled direct engagement of Panthers under conditions that earlier would have required calling for specialized tank destroyers or accepting heavy losses. The strategic impact of HVAP during the Bulge battles proved significant, though difficult to quantify precisely. German armored forces, already hampered by fuel shortages, inadequate air cover, and logistical problems, faced American defenders, whose anti-tank capability had improved markedly since summer. Panthers that might have dominated battlefields through sheer technical superiority instead died to Sherman fire at ranges and under circumstances that German tactical planning had not anticipated. German commanders, expecting their armour superiority to compensate for American numerical advantages, discovered that the tactical equation had shifted. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army during the Bulge offensive, later acknowledged in post-war interrogations that American anti-tank capability, including HVAP ammunition, exceeded German intelligence estimates and contributed to the offensive's failure to achieve breakthrough objectives. By early January 1945, as German forces withdrew from the Bulge salient having failed to reach strategic objectives, American armored forces could claim hard-won tactical parity against German heavy armor. Sherman tanks remained inferior to Panthers in armor protection, firepower, and mobility when compared specifications chart. But in actual combat, where combined arms coordination, crew training, tactical skill, and ammunition effectiveness determined outcomes, American forces had achieved rough equivalents that numerical superiority could decisively exploit. The final months of the European war saw HVAP ammunition become standard equipment rather than scarce special rounds. Production increases through winter and spring. 1945 meant that Sherman crews could expect regular resupply of HVAP ammunition, carrying full combat loads of 20 rounds as routine rather than exception. This abundance, achieved too late to affect early campaign phases, demonstrated American industry's ability to solve tactical problems through manufacturing scale, once priorities were established and resources allocated. Technical refinements continued even as Germany collapsed. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground developed improved HVAP variants with better tungsten core bonding, reduced failure rates, and enhanced penetration characteristics. The M93A1 variant, standardized in early PaW 1945, incorporated lessons learned from combat experience and metallurgical improvements that enhanced reliability. These refinements, though incremental, demonstrated ongoing American commitment to ammunition effectiveness even as Allied victory became inevitable. The Korean War, beginning June 1950, provided unexpected combat test of HVAP effectiveness under different circumstances. American Sherman tanks, primarily the M4A38 variant armed with 76mm guns, faced Soviet-built 3485 tanks in North Korean and later Chinese service. Unlike the situation in Europe where HVAP had been critically scarce, by 1950 tungsten supplies were no longer constrained by competing wartime demands and substantial stocks remained available. American tank crews in Korea found that HVAP rounds easily penetrated 3485 armor at normal combat ranges. The Soviet tank, while capable, possessed armor protection significantly inferior to the Panther. Its 90mm thick turret front and 45mm thick glacis plate could not resist tungsten-cored projectiles fired at high velocity from 76mm guns. American Shermans in Korea achieved remarkably favorable exchange ratios against communist armor, due partly to superior crew training, but also significantly to plentiful availability of HVAP ammunition. The vindication of the 76mm Sherman in Korea was bittersweet for veterans of European combat. The ammunition that could have been more widely employed in 1944 proved devastatingly effective in Asia when supply constraints no longer limited employment. Many veterans wondered how many lives might have been saved, how many battles won more decisively, if American industry had prioritized HVAP production earlier or allocated resources more aggressively to overcome tungsten scarcity. German perspective on American HVAP ammunition, gathered from post-war interrogations and examination of captured documents, reflected grudging professional respect and deep frustration. German ordnance officers recognized that American industry had solved the tungsten-cored ammunition problem more successfully than German manufacturers, despite Germany having pioneered the underlying technology. While Germany had developed tungsten-cored ammunition with the Panzergranate 40 series, production limitations meant these rounds were never available in sufficient quantities. German tank crews interviewed after the war frequently mentioned American ammunition improvements as significant factors that complicated their tactical situation. The knowledge that Sherman tanks could penetrate Panther mantlets at combat ranges meant German crews could no longer simply rely on frontal armor for protection. This forced more cautious tactics, slower advances, and greater reliance on defensive positions. But defensive warfare ceded initiative to American forces, allowing them to employ combined arms tactics that negated German advantages. The psychological impact of losing armor invulnerability contributed to the increasingly defensive mindset that characterized German armored operations in 1945. Otto Carius, a highly decorated German tank ace who commanded Tiger tanks and survived the war, wrote extensively in his post-war memoirs about the psychological impact of facing enemies who could penetrate his armor. The sense of invulnerability that thick armor provided was crucial to crew morale and aggressive tactics. When that sense eroded, crew performance suffered measurably. Panther crews facing HVAP-equipped Shermans experienced this erosion of confidence. The mantlet became a known vulnerability that competent American crews could exploit. This knowledge made Panther crews demonstrably more cautious, slower to engage, and generally less willing to take tactical risks. The Americans had not just developed better ammunition. They had destroyed German confidence. The technical countermeasures explored by German engineers revealed both ingenuity and desperation. Armor specialists proposed adding supplementary armor plates to Panther glacis plates, creating spaced armor that might defeat tungsten penetrators. Others suggested operational adjustments, maintaining greater engagement distances, using terrain more aggressively, and avoiding static defensive positions where American gunners could take careful aim. Every solution carried costs in mobility, tactical flexibility, or production capacity that Germany could ill afford. Supplementary armor increased weight, stressing already unreliable Panther transmissions and reducing operational mobility. Maintaining greater engagement distances worked only when terrain and tactical situation permitted, conditions increasingly rare as American forces pressed their offensive. More aggressive terrain usage required training and tactical sophistication that hastily formed late-war German units often lacked. By late winter 1945, as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine and Soviet armies closed on Berlin from the east, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. German armoured forces, once the Wehrmacht's cutting edge, existed as shadows of their former strength. Panther production, which had reached 3,900 units in 1944, collapsed in early 1945 as factories were bombed, transportation networks disrupted, and raw materials became unavailable. Even when Panthers were produced, fuel shortages often kept them immobile. German tank units in the final months frequently abandoned tanks not because of combat damage, but because they had no fuel to operate them. The technical superiority that Panthers possessed over Shermans mattered little when tanks couldn't move, when crews had minimal training, when ammunition supplies were exhausted, and when Allied air superiority meant that any movement invited devastating attack. The strategic implications of HVAP development extend to broader questions about technological competition in modern warfare and the crucial importance of industrial capacity. Both American and German research establishments possessed competent engineers and sophisticated understanding of ballistics and armor penetration. Both recognized the value of tungsten-cored ammunition early in the war, and both developed functional designs. The critical difference came down to industrial capacity and resource availability rather than scientific knowledge. American industry could produce HVAP in quantities sufficient to influence battlefield outcomes meaningfully, though never enough to fully equip all units. German industry could barely produce enough to conduct testing. This pattern repeated across numerous weapon systems throughout the war. Germany developed sophisticated and often technically superior weapons, but could not produce them in quantities that affected strategic outcomes. American industrial capacity produced less sophisticated but highly effective equipment in overwhelming numbers. The M4 Sherman was objectively not the best tank of World War II by most technical measures, but American factories produced approximately 49,324 of them, compared to approximately 6,132 Panthers. This 8-to-1 production ratio, combined with ammunition improvements like HVAP that reduced the technical gap, proved strategically decisive. The post-war careers of veterans who fought at Arracourt and subsequent battles reflected the enduring impact of these combat experiences on military thinking. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion at Arracourt with distinction, arose to become United States Army Chief of Staff and gave his name to the Abrams main battle tank. The lessons Abrams learned about combined arms warfare, the critical importance of crew training, and the necessity of adequate ammunition influenced his entire career and the doctrine he helped develop. The Abrams was deliberately designed with a powerful 120mm smoothbore gun and sophisticated ammunition types, including depleted uranium penetrators that serve functionally the same role HVAP served in World War II. The continuity from 1944 HVAP to present-day armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot ammunition illustrates how foundational lessons from World War II continue directly influencing military technology. German veterans of Panther units who survived the war and later joined the West German Bundeswehr brought different but equally important lessons. They had personally experienced the limitations of possessing technological superiority without the industrial base and logistics to support it. Bundeswehr armor doctrine during the Cold War emphasized quality and training while explicitly recognizing that West Germany could not match Soviet numerical superiority. The transformation of American tank crews from mid-1944 to early 1945 reflected the cumulative impact of combat experience, improved equipment availability, and familiarity with specialized ammunition, including HVAP. Crews that landed in Normandy in June 1944 often felt genuinely apprehensive about facing German armor, particularly Panthers and Tigers. By early 1945, after months of sustained combat, significant training improvements, increased availability of 76mm Shermans, and growing familiarity with HVAP ammunition, American tankers approached engagements far more confidently. This psychological shift had direct tactical consequences. Confident crews fought more aggressively, took calculated risks when opportunities appeared, and exploited tactical advantages. While HVAP ammunition alone did not create this transformation, its availability and proven effectiveness contributed meaningfully to improved American armored force morale and tactical performance. The legacy of HVAP development continues influencing modern ammunition design. American armor doctrine from 1945 onward consistently emphasized ammunition effectiveness as a critical component of tank design. Modern tank ammunition uses depleted uranium or tungsten alloy penetrators, materials chosen for essentially the same density and hardness properties that made tungsten carbide effective in World War II. The underlying principle remains constant. Concentrate maximum kinetic energy into a small, extremely dense projectile moving at the highest achievable velocity. Soviet and later Russian tank ammunition development followed remarkably similar paths, independently recognizing that armor-piercing capability depends heavily on projectile material properties and kinetic energy delivery. September 19th, 1944, when American Sherman crews first engaged Panthers with HVAP ammunition at Arracourt, marked a genuine turning point in the psychological balance of armored warfare. German crews who had fought confidently behind their armor learned that American tanks could pose a serious frontal threat. American crews who had felt outmatched gained meaningful confidence from knowing they possessed ammunition that could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances. This shift in tactical psychology, enabled by tungsten-cored ammunition produced in American factories, influenced every subsequent armored engagement of the European War. HVAP ammunition, though never available in desired quantities, provided enough improved capability to transform American tank crews from uncertain defenders into confident attackers willing to engage German armor directly. The crews who fired those first HVAP rounds in combat, watching tungsten cores punch through armor that had seemed invincible, demonstrated that industrial capacity and material science applied intelligently to urgent tactical problems could overcome seemingly insurmountable technical disadvantages. This fundamental lesson, learned at considerable cost on battlefields across Europe, remains directly relevant for military planners facing the technological challenges of modern warfare. The morning fog at Arracourt had lifted by noon on September 19th, revealing fields littered with burning Panthers, their supposedly impregnable armor betrayed by American ammunition that German intelligence had never expected to encounter in such quantities. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, crouching in a hedgerow watching his Panther burn, the lesson was brutally clear. The invincibility that German tankers had relied upon had proven illusory. The Americans had found the answer, and they had manufactured it in quantities sufficient to change the war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.